Now, the news of the summons being issued against Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan has rocked the market, with the JSE Banking Index losing more than 5% at one point this morning, and the rand has lost just shy of 3% to the US currency. Now, what does all of this mean for the sovereign credit rating, which is set to take place in December by various rating agencies, and of course the economic outlook for South Africa? Well, joining us to share their analysis of these and of course some of their concerns with regard to the overall market dynamics, joining us from our JSE studios is Mohammed Nalla, Head of Strategic Research at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. Here with me in our Johannesburg studios is Nhamo, Associate Director for Global Financial Innovations, and via Skype from Cape Town we have Rashaad Tayob, Portfolio Manager at Abax. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today and your time and analysis. But Mohammed, I'd like to start off with you by just getting your response and immediate reaction to all of this noise. Seems as though we've shot ourselves in the foot again. Would you agree, Mohammed?
Yeah, look, I mean, Gugu, the timing is certainly unfortunate, to say the least. We're literally 2 weeks away from the midterm budget. If you have a look at the date set down for when the finance minister is set to appear in court, it's literally a week after the midterm budget. And all of this comes in the backdrop of the fact that we've got the ratings agencies visiting South Africa during the course of November. They're set to set down their final review for this year in the first week of December. That's S&P. And the irony of this, Gugu, is that, you know, things, if you have a look at the metrics, they haven't been going fantastically, but they had stabilized somewhat. We've had some reasonably good data come through on the external front in terms of the trade deficit that swung into a surplus, meaning a narrower current account deficit. So it looked as though South Africa perhaps had what it took to just defer this ratings downgrade a little bit further in the absence of political risk. That's a big caveat. We put out a report last week stating just as much. And unfortunately, that's where we shoot ourselves in the foot. Political risk by international investors, the international investor community, is seen as very much binary. As soon as a negative news flow comes through, they don't necessarily wait to digest that information. You see very much a knee-jerk reaction come through. You saw a good 45 odd cents come through in terms of dollar rand, and you also saw around 25 basis points come through in terms of the benchmark bond. That all during the course of this morning. What's likely to happen is they're going to wait and see how this actually plays out, what the finance minister's response is, but it does predispose us to a degree of vulnerability that need not exist. Relative to other emerging markets, one parting point on this is that international investors like South Africa, it's a liquid emerging market, provided we don't continue scoring these own goals, given the fact that there is a global search for yield that remains at play. If we see a Fed hike, that could just put salt on the wound even further and may just exacerbate a little bit of a risk off. So very much in flux at this point in time, with a predisposition towards some weakness should the situation deteriorate any further.
Mohammed, staying with you for a moment, I want to get your analysis again on the investor reaction. As you've mentioned, often a knee-jerk reaction, especially from international investors. But as an asset manager, how do you deal with all this noise, given that we are also operating in a market environment where there just isn't any significant growth right now?
So you've got to break that down, Gugu, in terms of which asset classes you're looking at. I mean, if you looked at the JSE's reaction this morning, a little bit of an uptick on the back of the news, and that's because the JSE is not necessarily reflective of South African fundamentals. It's very much reflecting the uptick in the dollar rand, or the depreciation in the dollar rand, that gives you a boost in terms of some of your dual listed counters. If you have a look at bonds, as I mentioned, the knee-jerk reaction will certainly flush out some of the tactical positioning. Over the longer term, it very much depends on what your view is around the global economy. The global search for yield remains a key factor, even with a Fed hike on the table. If the Fed hikes 25 basis points, you still have the ECB, the BOJ, as well as the BOE providing easy monetary policy, and that remains your longer-term theme, being a search for yield. Effectively, international investors in that respect may just hold back for better entry points into South Africa.
Mohammed, before I let you go, though, the impact on the banking index, quite significant, shut down by just over 5%, if I'm not mistaken, today. And worst case scenario is that we could actually lose a finance minister here, but fingers crossed that that doesn't take place. But your analysis of the banking and financial services sector, and not forgetting with the blowout in the currency, increase in the oil price, this certainly means that inflation could tick up even further.
depending on where the rand goes, that would certainly impact your inflation profile, your inflation forecasts, and that will impact your views around the timing of rate hikes. A lot of people in the market have become fairly complacent around the potential for another rate hike from the SARB, and if the rand continues on this weakening trend that's just been exhibited from this morning onwards, that certainly will bring rate hike potential back onto the table, as the SARB would need to react to the potential for inflation to tick up on the back of a weaker rand. What does that do for your banking sector? The banking sector, as you mentioned, weaker on this news. Remember, at the end of the day, there are a number of factors that come into play here. If the consumer comes under any additional distress on the back of higher inflation, worse sentiment, lower investment, that's going to hurt the banking sector through an uptick in non-performing loans over the longer term. But also bearing in mind in terms of the fact of if you get an uplift in terms of interest rates in the shorter term, that may well also constrain the ability for consumers to take on credit, as well as the credit worthiness of certain customers that are currently on book. So still a fairly negative outlook there, that being reflected in a decline in that bank's index this morning.
Mohammed, thank you so much for your time and joining us for your analysis today. Well, we come to studio now where Nhamo is with us as well to give us your reaction as well as analysis of the situation. As we heard from Mohammed, Tim, again, the bond market, slight knee-jerk reaction, but looking at the R186, up by more than 2%. I'm a bit surprised by this particular move, given that one would think that there would be a slight decline here, given the investment reaction.
As far as I understand it, the yield's actually higher by about, went up between 20 and 30 basis points across the curve. The sort of thesis I tend to work on is, despite all the negativity that comes in, whenever we have a negative issue, there's a sell-off in the rand, there's a sell-off in the bonds, but because of the global search for yield, at some point the bond yield becomes a bit attractive, and the guys who like to play, especially the longer end of the bond, will come in, buy in the bonds, which then comes in to stabilize the currency somewhat. So, earlier on we'd seen a high, I think, up at about 14.32. We seem to be trading in the sort of 14.27-ish range, I think, from when I last checked. So the big thing now is, where do we close on the end of the day? What are the actual political sort of ramifications of the charge, given that it's 1 million in fraud, and the kind of thing was 7, and that kind of a thing. So levels to watch, I'd reckon to say would be, look for 14.55, 15.10, going into 16 progressively. Those are your main key sort of resistance levels going forward. We'd had a strong day yesterday, and I'd started to think maybe we would see a bit of a move towards 13, but it seems whenever I come on and say something, just we'll go the other way.
So clearly we need to hopefully change how the market views your opinion. But Rashaad, let's bring you into the conversation and get your view here. One would assume that despite all this noise taking place in the market, South Africa still seems like a very competitive economy, as has been reflected by Tim. According to the WEF Competitiveness Index, we've moved up 2 notches, well-respected capital markets, as well as accounting and auditing practices. But again, this is an unfortunate move which raises a lot of questions and increases the risk element of our growth trajectory.
Yes, I think in terms of where we stack up relative to other emerging markets, the institutional strength of the country has always, the institutions of the country has always been one of its strengths. But the worrying thing about moves like this, and especially moves on the Ministry of Finance, you've seen an erosion of that institutional strength. And the SARB and Treasury, I mean, S&P has been very clear on this, that the strength of SARB and Treasury is what is causing us to hang on to our investment grade rating. Without the strength of those two, we would already be downgraded a long time ago. You can't have zero growth. You can't have a massive increase in debt levels over the last 5 years while still, being viewed the same way in the international markets. So I think in a way the bond market has sold off 20-30 basis points. I think the bonds are down around 2%, not necessarily up 2%. I think that might just be a reading error. And so it has been a muted reaction, because I think we've seen this a few times before. People are getting immune to the noise. They don't necessarily know what's going to happen. But I think once they go ahead and digest some of what the meaning of this, I think the reaction can be even worse.
We're also joined by George Glynos, who's the Managing Director and Chief Economist at ETM Analytics. George, good to have you with us today. I want to piggyback off of the statements that have been shared by both Tim as well as Rashaad joining us today via Skype. And that's, of course, the independence of both Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank. Listening to the South African Reserve Bank Governor, Nhamo, he's been very bold in, again, highlighting the independence of this institution. But is Treasury not where we have significant concerns? Because if Pravin might get suspended or things reach a worst case scenario, we know that Mcebisi Jonas, the Deputy Minister, has also reported that the Guptas did offer him a job just over a few months ago. So this certainly raises significant questions about Treasury. What's your analysis of the independence factor there?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I would say they're very strongly independent. I know of the personalities that are involved in Treasury, and I would have absolutely no reason to doubt them at all. I think the problem is, when Pravin Gordhan, should he be replaced, who would replace him? I think that's really the question that's on everybody's lips at the moment. There's speculation it will be Brian Molefe. Now, Brian Molefe is known to be a Zuma man, in which case there are going to be natural questions about whether the state capture has then moved across the international treasury. And I mean, specifically, this is all revolving around the nuclear deal. Now, it could all just be speculation, but it's very strong speculation. And usually where there's smoke, there's fire. And I would be concerned. I think this is just more of the same. I mean, it's nothing new in the sense that this has been an ongoing saga for the better part of 9 months now. It's unfortunate that it's come to this, but I suspect that this is a reflection of what's going on within the ANC. I think that it's a reflection of a party that's in turmoil. I think it's a reflection of a president who's struggling to hold on to the influence that he needs to keep this all together. And that influence revolves largely around the patronage lines and his ability to keep current structures together. So, we heard one of the previous speakers just spoke about the possibility of a cabinet reshuffle. I think that is potentially a target for the Zuma faction in this whole debacle, because I don't know that President Zuma has the political capital on his own to remove Pravin Gordhan. He's going to need a reason to do so, and perhaps this is that reason. This offers him something to go with, which kind of alleviates the pressure on him personally of making the decision. He can resort to hiding behind the legal process for removal of Gordhan. But again, it will ultimately Google will come down to who they replace him with, and if it's somebody like Brian Molefe, I think there will be a lot of speculation that even National Treasury now is compromised, and that would be massively detrimental to the outlook for South Africa, given that should something like that happen, I think it would be a guarantee that a credit rating downgrade would be in the offing.
George, to stay with you, as you mentioned, credit rating downgrade are very likely come December. Thereafter, what are the economic impacts?
Well, I mean, look, a lot of it has been priced in. I mean, that's probably about as good a news as I can bring you right now, is that, looking at things like CDS spreads, they've been trading at levels higher than the likes of Turkey and Brazil and Russia, countries that are already in junk, that have already been downgraded to junk. So the fact that our CDS spreads are trading higher than that tells you that there's quite a lot that is priced in. There's always, of course, some mechanical movement of flow as fund managers, portfolio managers adjust to their mandates, and so one cannot rule out the possibility of volatility. But I think the damage is going to be done long before the credit ratings downgrade. The credit ratings downgrade, if anything, just reflects the status quo and how far South Africa has fallen from grace, as opposed to giving us a firm line of sight on the future. Remember also that in this current environment of hunt for yield, you're simply going to replace one set of investors for another. So I don't know that the impact is going to be as devastating as a lot of people make out. That being said, it's certainly not going to be positive, and I'm definitely not arguing for not paying attention to the drivers of that potential downgrade. So bad news all round. Government needs to get its act together, and it needs to stop this nonsense, because between the financial markets and business in general, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have line of sight on the outlook for the South African economy, which makes it almost impossible for businesses to plan and for capital to be deployed. And unfortunately, that's what we need if we're going to try and get growth moving.
Well, we'll continue with this analysis as we return from this very brief ad break, continuing to get market reaction as well as economic analysis and insight into the reaction from business leaders following the announcement that Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan has been issued with a court summons. We'll be back with more. We continue with our analysis of the market reaction and, of course, investor sentiment following the announcement that Finance Minister, together with his former associates at SARS, Opa Magashule as well as Ivan Pillay, being served with a court summons, and that confirmation coming through earlier this morning from the NPA, National Prosecuting Authority. But of course, a lot of the risk elements being highlighted. And before we actually get to our other guest, Dennis Dykes, to get his analysis of the situation, Rashaad, let's come to you via Skype. Again, lots of elements in the air and uncertainty as to how this might develop going forward. But what happens next? Because the main concern is that Pravin Gordhan has to deliver his mini budget in the next 2 weeks or so. Again, is there some lack of confidence in the market that he might actually stand at the podium to deliver this?
I think it is very doubtful about whether he'll actually be there in Parliament to deliver. I mean, the way I read the situation is that according to decisions by the ANC's General Council, any minister who has any charges of against them has to basically step aside and resolve those before he resumes his duties. And that I think that is one of the key driving forces behind the different attempts which have been made against Pravin Gordhan. A few months ago, we had the Hawks who summoned him to appear and were going to lay charges against them. At the end of the day, Pravin Gordhan decided not to appear. Therefore, charges weren't presented, and there was no ability.
It seems as though the audio levels, unfortunately, aren't very clear there with Rashaad. We'll continue working on that. Technical gremlins working against us, but we will get further clarity from Rashaad on his analysis. Dennis Dykes, now Chief Economist at Nedbank, also with us on the line. Dennis, good to have you as always. Very briefly, if we can pick up on some of the sentiments that have been shared by Rashaad regarding the continuation of the process now and whether or not Pravin will be able to deliver his mini budget in Parliament. What's your take here, Dennis?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not sure of the technicalities, but obviously I think the minister will be going to the heart of the charges and that will basically be looking at the legal avenues ahead of over the coming days. The timing obviously is truly unfortunate. I mean, the minister's just got back, having spent a week in New York and Washington, convincing the international investment community, and South Africa is a good case for investment. We've got the mini budget coming up. It's just ridiculous, to be honest, and it just really does seem as though this whole thing is politically motivated. It cannot be logical for the timing. Every time something like this happens, it's at a critical time, whether it be the medium-term budget policy statement, that was at the time of the budget earlier this year. It just is quite extraordinary how badly this has been handled.
Dennis, to stay with you for a moment, what does this mean for South Africa's economic growth prospects? I think GDP forecasts from both Treasury and the SARB currently stand at 0.1 or 0%. Given that this might see the private sector and other international investors sitting on capital, does this mean that we could see minimal growth this year?
Well, I mean, this year pretty much settled at this point. I mean, we're already in October, so it's going to be somewhere between 0.2, maybe at best 0.4% growth for this year. The question is next year. You know, in everyone's forecast, you've got to go up to around about 1%. Part of that would be a recovery in agriculture, so a technical part of that would be the recovery there. But it would also assume some improvement in investor confidence. And one of the key weaknesses this year has been private sector investment, fixed investment spending has actually come under significant pressure. And people are very uncertain about the political and policy environment. Now, if this continues deep into next year, then obviously you can have further economic setbacks.
Dennis, very briefly before I let you go, you mentioned the efforts by the Finance Minister and private sector representatives in Washington together with New York. We've also seen several CEOs gather to set up a fund for development of SMMEs. Are these efforts enough to see us divert a downgrade come December?
Well, look, I mean, I think they're definitely a good step in the right direction. There's material resources being put to play here to actually try and boost employment in the short term and to actually create a longer term, in the longer term, a more favorable environment. But the key issue here is really the political and policy environment and how that plays out. And obviously this does put a lot of that into jeopardy. I think under any circumstance that the finance minister is no longer in place, the local and foreign investment community is going to be highly skeptical as to the reasons. Highly skeptical, and that will put a dampener on investment prospects. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if Minister Gordhan is suspended or, you know, put on or has to actually leave his post, you know, I think that will be extremely negative.
Dennis, thank you so much for your time. That's Dennis Dykes, Chief Economist at Nedbank. We still have Tim Nhamo with us here in studio. Tim, again, we've heard a lot of the analysis coming through from a lot of our colleagues, but what happens now? I'm sure you're going to interact with a lot of clients who will be incredibly nervous about the way going forward, but your analysis of what we could see unfolding in the next few weeks?
Well, one of the things that, because I only just was able to watch the press conference before coming through here, was at the beginning of the press conference, there was a mention of his trip to New York and a comment that he made in terms of a rough approximation of, I think what he said was that it was kind of political shenanigans and you kind of get them in every country. So at the beginning of the NPA press conference, there was actually reference made to that. Mm. And then, you know, if you sort of look through the essence of what was in the conference, it was sort of, well, we're investigating the rogue unit, but we do feel that there's a fraud issue. So we're summoning to appear in court. But what I think is not clear, and I suppose I'm not really a legal person, is can you be summoned to appear in court or are you facing criminal charges? Because there's the issue of if you, there's the, I think we'd call it a leadership code or whatever you want to call it, and within the ANC of if you have criminal charges, then you've got to resign. Mm. But if there are no charges and it's just appearing in court, maybe because he didn't go the last time the Hawks asked him to show up, maybe that's what a lot of it is around. So the NPA goes off and has a press conference about, oh, well, you know, we're really independent and we this and we that, which I suppose, you know, they might want to do, but then you also then have all these economic ramifications with the uncertainty and what exactly are you're going to do. And I think one of the issues that was also raised was very close to this Hillary Clinton thing of, you know, you can have behavior which is somewhat criminal but not necessarily prosecuted. Mm. And the NPA hasn't decided on that either. So at the end of the day, it's this sort of very nebulous situation. You're not too sure what's going on. But I do think the markets, to a certain extent, from an offshore perspective, are getting more and more used to it. And if anything, it creates a lot of volatility that if you're brave enough, you can, you know, you can profit off.
Exactly. Well, we will continue getting feedback as to how those claims or rather charges do also impact. We do know that it's two issues actually that you did allude to, which is not only the suspicions into the alleged rogue unit at SARS, but also with regard to fraudulent activity with regard to Ivan Pillai's early retirement package amounting to more than 1.1 million rand. So again, further clarity that's required here. But Rashaad, let's come back to you and maybe also focus on SARS as an institution. I know that you're not a political analyst, but however, again, the independence question keeps coming up. It's been poised to the SARB, it's been poised to Treasury, but SARS as well as an institution seeing all these significant leadership changes and now where the queries keep coming up about issues from a few years back. Your thoughts on this and the critical element that SARS also faces, because ultimately they help us collect tax, which helps improve South Africa's kitty.
Yeah, can I just comment first? I mean, there's been a lot of talk by the other guests around the uncertainties about what's going on. I don't actually think there's any uncertainty. I think that there has been a concerted effort to at least charge Gordhan and give President Zuma the cover in which to replace him. It is very difficult politically after what happened with Nene to fire Gordhan without any cover. And I think that the moves that have been made on him are to provide the president with cover. So Gordhan, what Sean Abrams said today was that Gordhan is being charged for fraud. And at the moment, so there is reasonable case, according to the ANC's own rules, to be able to ask him to step aside until the charges have been resolved. Now, what he's actually being charged for is to do with the early retirement package. So the finance minister of this country, who's in charge of a budget of over 1 trillion rand, is now being charged for fraud over an early retirement case amounting to 1 million rand. It's absolutely absurd. Sean Abrams actually spent a lot of time talking about the rogue unit, but I don't understand. Well, there was no reason to do that because he isn't actually charging Pravin Gordhan about what happened with the rogue unit. He doesn't have enough information. He spent a lot of time doing that, but all he's charging him is with fraud around an early retirement package. So I don't think anyone can reasonably say this is not a political motivated attempt to provide cover for President Zuma to replace him. Mm-hmm. And the implications of that, and once that seeps through into the market, can be a lot severe and with a bigger market reaction than what people are presuming at the moment.
At the top of this conversation, Rashaad, Tim did walk us through his technical analysis of which direction the rand might go, and again highlighting the increased potential to the upside. But your analysis of how the market will continue to react in the upcoming days until we receive some kind of further clarity. Looking at the currency at the moment, we're still at 14.26 to the US dollar. So again at those weakening levels. But your perspective as to where we might see the rand go?
I think we've seen some weakness in the rand and bonds, but if the game plan of Zuma is to actually get rid of Pravin Gordhan, I think it can move a lot more. So, and I don't think we need to doubt Zuma's intentions, President Zuma's intentions, because he has, he's tried to do this before and he's been thwarted. In this case, he's actually managed for charges to be presented against Gordhan. So this is the first time he has the cover to take this action. And the question is who the replacement, whether the replacement is going to be someone with some credibility or someone with zero credibility. And I think the reaction of the market will depend on those two. I mean, Des van Rooyen was someone who no one had ever heard of. So to replace a finance minister, probably one of the most important cabinet positions, in the country, with someone no one has ever heard of, without the requisite experience, with zero credibility, I think it wasn't surprising that you had the sell-off to the extent that you had. You had the biggest bond sell-off since the emerging market crisis of '98. Whether the bonds are going to react to a new finance minister in the same way will depend on the credibility of that minister. And I think, if you have a compromised candidate like Brian Molefe, maybe you have a bit more weakness. But if there's another totally non-credible candidate, I think the reaction will be very similar to what happened before, if not worse.
Tim, coming back to you, though, to pick up on what Rashaad mentioned, if there's a possibility that the finance minister might be replaced here, isn't that exactly what the market does not want? Because Mcebisi Jonas, deputy minister, does seem to be kind of isolated at the moment. As we earlier said, he did confirm that the Guptas did attempt to offer him a job. So the question is, if not Pravin, if not Mcebisi, who next?
Well, that's one of the issues is, and I suppose it shows how far off the map we are, because I've always been under the impression that you have a person in charge and the deputy, because if the person in charge is not there, then you switch to the deputy. So I suppose maybe in a more normal situation you'd assume that if Pravin had to step aside, then the deputy finance minister would become the minister, because then you've got continuity. But the fact that his name never gets mentioned in anyone's conversation is just an underlying, it just shows how badly off the map the situation, the local situation is, and how varied it can be, and how okay, fair enough, we might end up with Brian Molefe and so on, and what's going to happen with that, and what the and what the implications of his decisions or the bent that he might take going forward.
At the moment, all of this is speculation, Tim, but in your analysis and your experience, and obviously your liaison with clients and discussing investment opportunities, what kind of clarity would you seek as an investor to help calm the situation?
Well, it's just this thing. It looked early on one of the screens like there might be a press conference with the minister himself. I'm not sure if that was file
that's
tape
file footage where they had a briefing at the JSE.
All right. Yeah, is clarity on is he staying, is he going, and who his replacement is going to be. In the meantime, you just sort of look to trade the volatility. Where the rand closes today is going to be quite important. We're below that 32 high from the morning, which is quite interesting. The bond yields have started to come back a bit. If the situation does deteriorate, you'll have another blowout, and it will be successive. But I don't really think it will be as bad as it was in December. Well, not immediately anyway. I mean, December was quite bad. The December-January period. You know, where we had those highs going above 17 and so on. But I think there's a lot of selling interest above 16, and then again you've also got this issue of the buying interest on the bond side. On, you know, if the very long end of the South African bond curve on just risk-off selling goes towards 10%, it starts to become a very attractive buy, and then you get dollar inflows on that because offshores are coming in to get the yield, and then that in turn stabilizes the rand a little bit.
Rashaad, I want to come back to you for a moment and briefly discuss what this means for the South African Reserve Bank. The governor also previously mentioned in the last meeting in September that we have started to approach the end of the hiking cycle, but new elements and dynamics are at play with regard to the inflation outlook. Again, increased volatility in the currency, which we still uncertain as to how weak it might continue to fall, and the rising oil price, which is currently trading around $42 per barrel, again on the back of OPEC tightening their oil supply, playing on the market dynamics there of supply and demand. Your analysis of how this might change the analysis for the South African Reserve Bank and their monetary positioning stance?
Yes, I think the Reserve Bank saw inflation heading below the target band again, back towards around 5%, and they were happy to signal that the hiking cycle was potentially over. However, they were at pains to mention that the threshold for cuts was very high. So I think a lot of economists had begun to get quite excited about the, you know, as soon as the rand dips below 6, now it's time to cut rates again. But I think the Reserve Bank was very, and Lesetja Kanyako, Daniel Manele came out and said that the threshold for cuts is quite severe. We need to see inflation, sustainably within the target band and maybe closer to the middle. Now, the inflation outlook was looking particularly good given the strength of the rand. You know, the rand strengthened phenomenally in September. At one stage, we were, up 10% against the dollar. But unfortunately, a lot of that has reversed, even today. And the oil price has moved up. So the models that they use in terms of what the inflation forecasts are going forward will have evolved and shifted upwards. And I think we can now say that the threshold for cuts will definitely not be met. However, we are in an ultra-low global interest rate environment. So the Reserve Bank, unless the rand, moves totally out of control back to 16, 17, I don't think we necessarily need to hike rates aggressively if things remain under control. But obviously, given these political developments, there could be an incident where, scenarios where the Reserve Bank doesn't necessarily want to hike rates, but is actually forced to by the market. And that's the scenarios that we are quite cautious of at the moment, and the scenarios that can unfold in the case of the finance minister being replaced.
Before we wrap up though, Tim, let's get your perspective on it. We often analyze the MPC meetings when they take place, but I think going forward, it's going to be a little bit tougher for the governor and his colleagues, right?
I suppose in terms of what he said about the rate hike cycle being at an end, I think that's probably softened quite a bit. In terms of today's move and what we're going to see going forward, in the absence of further clarity, I'd like to see, say, about the dollar rand retrace about half of the loss today. If we can do that and close below there, it's a fairly positive move. If we start closing towards 14.30 and above, that's a little bit more negative going on into the rest of the week. I mean, it's still Tuesday, fairly early in the week. But again, so then the level to watch again would be your 14.55 and then 15.10, and then we see where we go from there.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, blame it on algorithms for the pound, but South African rands, we do it ourselves, clearly. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for today. That was Nhamo as well as Rashaad Tayob, who joined us via Skype, giving us their analysis of the market reaction and situation going forward regarding the Finance Minister receiving a court summons.